And here I just, Matt, this is my interpretation of the different views of different camps of eschatology. And we'll start out on the, I guess, it would be your left, where we were the most allegorical, the most spiritual, would be the amillennialists. And they really, you know, we're in the spiritual kingdom now. Christ is ruling and reigning from the Father's throne, and that is the Davidic throne, and we're going to see that. And that has huge implications for how we view Israel and everything else. But that's there. Then you have post-millennialism. Well, they do believe that Christ will they do believe Christ is going to physically come at the end of the millennium, but there's still this kingdom that he's ruling over now. I don't know that's as popular a view as amillennialism. It seems like amillennialism seems to dominate in that camp. And then there's a newer view that has come up, which, you know, and I almost think that's almost in response to dispensationalism, taking scriptures literally, is they're trying to fit the events of eschatology into the 70 AD. What happened in 70 AD? Anybody?
The fall of Jerusalem.
The temple was, the fall of Jerusalem. So they try to fit all the end-time prophecies into that one event. And by doing that, you have to make a lot of things non-literal. So, that, you know, they start off with this idea that they're going to take things literally, but then they really can't because the events don't line up. So I kind of, those are more on the allegorical side. And then you have really what we'll call premillennialism. There's different flavors of that. And again, that is much more on the literal side. And the first one, which is probably the oldest of these views, and again, that doesn't bother me because I think we have to allow that, you know, doctrine evolves over time, and even within dispensationalism, doctrine has changed a lot as we've fine-tuned and gotten to understand things, and actually, I believe, taken things more literally. But a lot of the early dispensationalists really came out of post-tribulationalism. But really, they believe that the rapture will happen at the end of the tribulation, and then there'll be a millennial kingdom. Then there'll come the millennial kingdom. And then I call this other thing called other rapture views. And you have things called the pre-wrath rapture, the mid-trib rapture, the partial rapture. And to the certain, whatever degree they are, they're spiritualizing some of the scriptures to get there. Then I have another camp, which actually is pre-tribulational, but they believe that we're in the kingdom now in terms of Christ ruling and reigning on the Davidic throne. And they do that by some different hermeneutical methods that we won't go into called progressive dispensationalism. I'm sure Matt's familiar with that from some people at Dallas Theological Seminary. And we're not going to critique that, but just realize that there's some spiritualization of some of the scriptures to get to that point. And then at the most literal, and I don't put it all the way to the end of the literal because I still think that we're evolving in terms of our understanding of literal, is what I'll call classical dispensationalism, Ryrie. I mean, if you look at some of the early Wolvert stuff, you'll see that they start to spiritualize. They have two new covenants. I mean, they're grappling with things, and they're learning along the way. So dispensationalism kind of moves, is moving also. It's not like, oh, this is the way everybody believed for all time. And then I have my favorite of the group is the dispensational date setters. And I was going to put some pictures up, but I decided not to because we're not here to talk about people. But one of my favorites that I always and I really like watching the guy. So it's not like I'm trying to be overly negative, and I don't watch him a lot. But Jack Van Impe, has anybody heard of Jack Van Impe? And he has a show it's basically like he reads the newspaper and then he says how it fits into Scripture. And every little thing that happens in the news is somehow lined up in the Scripture, and of course, and the Lord's going to return soon because look at all this stuff is happening. And I think the right view is there's nothing that has to happen between now and the rapture. Okay, can certain things happen between now and the rapture? Absolutely. But nothing has to happen. We're not looking for anything to happen. We don't have to look to the newspaper to get our exegesis. We look to the Scriptures, and then if something were to pass, we can say, hey, look at that. It's interesting that it happened. But we don't hang our hat on that. And I remember in the early 90s, I was a young believer, and they were signing the Camp David Accords, and I didn't fully understand all this yet. And people say, "Oh, this could be the peace treaty, with the Antichrist, and it's a 7-year, and no, it couldn't have been." But we're looking at the newspaper, and we're trying to fit in the events of the newspaper in there. And I've never read the late great Planet Earth, and I really have a lot of respect for. Hal Lindsey has done some good things, but I have heard that there's some of that in that book where he tries to point to different things. So I think we need to shy away from that and not kind of get so hyped up on the events of the day, because Israel's enemy 20 years ago was the Soviet Union, and now you'd say, okay, now it's Russia. So so if we made the Soviet Union the evil empire, but now it has to be Russia, it's just, let's wait till we see it unfold. It'll happen. But I do want to point out that it's not just dispensationalists that are date setters. Like I said, these preterists are date setters. They're looking at an event on 70 AD and trying to stuff all this stuff into 70 AD, and it just doesn't work. So anyway, that's just a little view of the different views within the Scripture. Matt, anything I said wrong on those?
That's a great chart. Okay. That's really super.
Yeah, Clarence Larkin put this one together, so I just copied it from him. This is nice notes. Okay, so here's the other thing: date setting versus the Bible. I like this one. I didn't want to put any pictures up, but I like this one. 88 reasons why did anybody get this book? Did anybody remember this book? 88 reasons why the rapture will be in 1988. Okay, and then underneath it, it's the Feast of Trumpets. So I don't know if he's assuming that that's when the rapture would happen on the Feast of Trumpets. No, I can tell you the rapture can happen on the Feast of Trumpets. But I don't, we'll talk about this. I don't think the Feast of Trumpets is picturing the rapture, because the rapture is for the church, and the Feast of Trumpets is for the nation of Israel. Now, that's just my view. At other points in my life, I felt, well, maybe it was picturing the rapture, but I've kind of come to the point where the rapture is a signless event, and if it's going to happen, no. But anyway, so 88 reasons why the rapture will be there in 1988.
When was this published? When was it published?
In probably 1987, my guess. Yeah, it's in its 5th edition.
That's great.
But anyway, let's and this is not necessarily particularly talking about the rapture, but I think Jesus, the attitude that Jesus has. The disciples ask him after the resurrection, "Lord, is it the time you are restoring the kingdom to Israel?" Notice the kingdom hasn't been restored even after Jesus died on the cross. He said to them, "It's not for you to know the time or the epochs which the Father has fixed in his own authority." I was showing this to Lauren earlier, and I said, there's only one date setter, the Father. Okay? He's the only one who can set dates. Everybody else, we need to just watch and wait and hope. Anyway, so a little fun there with date setting. Let's understand the implications of a literal interpretation. I think there's people like, I'm going to pick on somebody, R.C. Sproul, who's brilliant. And if you've ever listened to the guy is just, he just knows a lot. Okay? But I think he's in Savannah. and you're going to see here why. I don't feel I have to debate people about this, because it's not about how much this person understands the Scripture. If the guy made a wrong turn somewhere, everything else is going to be wrong. And so, let me read this here. If the Old Testament, this is from John Wolford, and I think I sent this to you earlier, Joy, when you were telling me that Jay was working on the paper on interpretation.
Yeah.
If the Old Testament is allowed to stand in its prophecies of a future for Israel, most of the scholars agree that it would be normal to expect precisely what the premillennialists anticipate. That is, that Israel would return to the land, possess it, and enjoy it while being ruled by their coming Messiah. Premillennialism is based on such a literal interpretation, in contrast to amillennialism, which interprets these prophecies in a non-literal sense. Many amillennialism admit that the issue is literal interpretation. Now, Elias, and he was a biggie in the 1940s. He really came out against dispensationalism. He says, for instance, the Old Testament prophecies if literally interpreted, cannot be regarded as having been yet fulfilled or as being capable of fulfillment in this present age. Now, I'm quoting John Wolford, quoting Elias, but I actually went back when I was in seminary, and I went and got the book that Wolford was quoting from because I wanted to see the quote, and this is what he's saying. So, what is he saying? If you take the scriptures literally, you end up with a premillennial view, okay? And then he said, in a similar way, Hamilton, who I don't know who he is, but obviously he's quoting him, states, now we must frankly admit that a literal interpretation of the Old Testament prophecies gives us just a picture of an earthly reign of the Messiah as the premillennialist pictures. That was the kind of a messianic kingdom that the Jews of the time of Christ were looking for. Didn't we just read that? Now you're going to restore the kingdom? On the basis of a literal interpretation of the Old Testament. So the Jews of Jesus' time were interpreting the Old Testament literally, and premillennialists interpret the Old Testament literally. That's why I don't have to debate R.C. Sproul in any scripture, because our presuppositions, where we're starting from, are totally different. And so, if you don't accept the scriptures as being literal, then you're going to end up with a different conclusion. If you accept them being literal, yes, there'll be differences. And yes, there'll be people who can debate whether this thing happens before that thing, and when do the seal judgments happen, when do the bowl judgments happen, and when do the trumpet, when does all that, when does all book, what's the chronology of all the judgments in the book of Revelation? But that's minor. The big issue is interpretation and literal, and that's why I'm spending time on that. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes.
So really, the issue is literal interpretation, and that's why I spent some time on it, because I'm presuming that we're interpreting the covenants literally. And we're going to see some things tonight as we go through some of the issues. The issues are: do you interpret the Davidic covenant literally? Do you interpret the new covenant literally? Who's the new covenant with?
Us, the believers.
It's with Israel.
Is it?
Yeah, we'll see that. Now, we'll go through this. The blessings are given as, and we talked about that in Genesis 12, 1-3. That the whole world will be blessed.
Right.
So, but the actual covenant is made with the nation of Israel, but it's made to bless the whole world. Okay, so that the nations can partake in the spiritual blessings of these covenants, but they're not made with them. Does that make sense? Yeah. It's kind of like if your dad's a millionaire, you get to enjoy the blessings too, even though you're not a millionaire. So anyway, so we're gonna go through this. We talked about covenant, unconditional versus conditional. Let's go back and look at Genesis 12, 1-3, because as I said, I believe it's such a pivotal scripture. There's one other pivotal scripture right around it that we'll look at too, that is not necessarily germane to here, but it's one of my favorite Old Testament scriptures, so I don't want to pass up on it, pass the chance to read it. So Genesis 12, 1-3. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." I'm going to talk about later, we're going to see the New Testament tells us specifically that there's that spiritual blessing that through the whole world. We'll see that from Galatians. But let's move over to Genesis 15. Verse 6. Let's start in verse 5. And he took him outside and said, "Now look towards the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." Then he, being Abram, believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. And if you read, it'll say later on,